Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome back to Vlogmas. Today I'm going to be carrying on with my 5 Victorian novels about series, and today I'm going to be telling you about 5 Victorian novels about religion. So, I have 5 Victorian novels I want to talk to you about today that all look really interestingly at religion as a theme, many of which look both at the kind of social constructs around religion as well as kind of spiritual religion as well. I myself am not religious, but I find religion as a theme in Victorian literature absolutely fascinating, one that interests me again and again and again. Because Britain during the Victorian period was a very Christian country, a lot of Victorian literature looks at Christianity in major and minor ways. And I couldn't decide for a long time while thinking about this video whether or not I wanted to make this video 5 Victorian books about Christianity or 5 Victorian books about religion. I have decided to go with religion more broadly, although the only 2 religions discussed in the books I'm going to be talking about are Christianity and Judaism, because it's not that common in Victorian literature to find any other religions discussed. Like number 6, if I had made this video longer, would have been Kim by Rudyard Kipling, but I don't think it's really about religion, although it does touch a bit on Buddhism and Hinduism in India in the late 19th century. So if you're interested in religion in Victorian literature, Kim might be one worth looking at as well, but it's not one of the ones I want to focus on today. So I have 5 books to talk to you about today, all of which look at religion in quite different ways. One of them looks at Anglicanism, one of them looks at kind of dissenter movements, one of them looks at Catholicism, and the other 2 look at Judaism. So let's get into those 5 books. The first one I want to mention is Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. Now, I'm slightly cheating here because on the one hand I'm talking about Barchester Towers, but also Barchester Towers is kind of here to stand in for the whole Barchester Chronicles by Anthony Trollope, because the series as a whole looks really interestingly at religion. Barchester Towers is especially interesting on this account. It's not that much about kind of spiritual and personal religion, but it's very, very, very much about church politics in a really, really fascinating way. The old bishop and many of the people who surrounded him are all more high church. They place a kind of greater emphasis on ritual. The new bishop who comes in to Barchester at the beginning of this book, and the people who surround him are very low church and place a greater emphasis on kind of self-reflection and not ritual. I mean, that's like really pared down. That's a very simplified version of the high church, low church debate within Victorian society, but that gives you like a vague idea of what it's about. I find the way this book looks at church politics really, really interesting. It's very catty and full of hypocrisies. Mr. Proudie, the bishop, you know, him and his wife will invite the Grantlys, who are on the other side of the debate, round for dinner, and they'll all sit there and be very polite to each other while secretly they really hate each other. It's very, very cleverly and interestingly done, and it really looks at kind of the way the Victorian Anglican church works and the kind of divisions within it. It just examines it really, really interestingly and is a really, really powerful, fascinating read. Barchester Chronicles as a whole is also really interesting in terms of examining the kind of position of clergymen within the Victorian period and kind of the different moral standards they were held to. So all in all, a really interesting book, and one I would definitely recommend if you're interested in kind of explorations of religion and religion's impact on kind of society in the Victorian period. The next novel that I want to mention is Ruth by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a really interesting novel, and one that is definitely a bit more about kind of personal religion and personal growth through religion in many ways. I have sometimes described Ruth as Tess of the D'Urbervilles if it were written by someone who had more belief in humanity. It has a kind of similar setup in the beginning. Ruth is a working class girl who as a teenager gets involved with a much wealthier and slightly older man she runs away with, and after she falls pregnant he deserts her, and the book kind of follows her life from there. She ends up getting taken in by a dissenting minister and his sister, and the way the book looks at kind of Ruth coming to terms with her past and the way the world views her, and learning to not hate herself despite how sex outside of marriage, and especially having a child outside of marriage, was viewed in the Victorian period is really, really interesting. And Ruth is a book that is very, very bound up with religion and kind of Ruth's religious journey in a way that I found very, very interesting. I have to say that although it is one of the most interesting things about the book, it is probably the reason why Ruth is not one of my favourite Elizabeth Gaskell novels, because the book is so much about a kind of personal religious journey, and as someone who's not religious, I think I wanted in that book some salvation for Ruth and some self-confidence for Ruth that was not bound up in religion. Yet at the same time, if you look at Ruth as a novel about religion, it's absolutely fascinating, because in many ways the value that Ruth has for herself and the value that she can find in herself is all bound up in the belief that God loves her, and is all bound up in religion. And it's also bound up in her relationship with the dissenting minister she lives with, and the way that he talks to her and he views her, and the fact that him and his sister take her in and do not believe that she is, you know, fallen or a sinner, and that they do look after her and love her her and she becomes part of their family. It's a really, really fascinating book, and one that I would definitely recommend, especially if you're interested in the role of religion within Victorian literature. The next book I want to recommend is Zoe by Geraldine Dewsbury. This is not my favourite novel by Geraldine Dewsbury. My favourite by her is The Half-Sisters, which I do think is a superior novel to Zoe for many reasons. But when it comes to examinations of religion within Victorian literature, Zoe is absolutely fascinating. There are two central characters in Zoe. One of them is an atheist and the other is a Catholic priest. That's not very common in Victorian literature and is absolutely fascinating. Also, the one who is a Catholic priest, Everard, kind of struggles with his faith over the course of the book and kind of experiences doubts, and the way the book looks at that and his kind of difficulties, not always knowing what he believes, but being in a position of kind of power and trust within the Catholic Church where he is imparting knowledge to other young men. I found that really, really interesting. And also his relationship with the character of Zoe, who is effectively an atheist. You know, she doesn't really believe in God, and the discussions they have about religion and the impact they have on each other's lives and how that is kind of bound up with religion is really, really interesting. And I also think it's a very interesting book for looking at a different part of Christianity within the Victorian period, because it's quite rare in Victorian literature to find Catholicism dealt with properly and sympathetically. Catholicism is kind of touched on a little bit in Villette by Charlotte Bronte, but sometimes kind of unpleasantly and judgmentally, whereas I feel like Zoe has a much more complicated and sympathetic view of Catholicism and is really, really interesting to read in terms of looking at the Roman Catholic Church, and also in terms of looking at how Catholic people in Britain were treated differently to the Anglican Christians around them, and also to the dissenting Christians. Like, there is a concern about and a distrust of dissenter churches, well, chapels, in the Victorian period, but there's a much greater distrust of Catholicism, which is something that's really interesting when it's explored in 19th century literature. On to two books that talk about Judaism. The first I want to mention is Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Now, I have to say it's been a couple of years since I've read this one, but I really like Daniel Deronda. It is definitely my favourite George Eliot novel. George Eliot, as you may know if you've watched some of my videos before, is not my favourite Victorian writer, but Daniel Deronda is definitely my favourite of her books, and I think it's a really, really interesting one, and very interesting in terms of religion and the way that it looks at Judaism. Early on in the book, the character of Daniel Deronda meets a young woman called Mira, who is Jewish. If I remember correctly, he's never met anyone who is Jewish before, and in his kind of friendship and growing attachment to her, he becomes really interested in Judaism. He goes to Jewish areas in London, makes friends with other Jewish people, and begins to learn more and more about Judaism, and also to feel kind of drawn to it in some ways himself. It's a really, really interesting book, and one I would definitely recommend if you're interested in the way Victorian novels look at religion. However, I don't necessarily know how accurate I believe Daniel Deronda is in terms of its presentation of what it was like to be Jewish in the Victorian period, because the next book I want to talk about, Reuben Sachs by Amy Levy, criticises Daniel Deronda at a few points. In fact, I will read you the little extract that's on the flap of my Persephone Classics version. "I wonder," cried Rose, throwing herself into the breach, "what Mr. Lee Harrison thought of it all." "I think," said Leo, "that he was shocked at finding us so little like the people in Daniel Deronda." "Did he expect," cried Esther, "to see our boxes in the hall ready packed and labelled Palestine?" "I have always been touched," said Leo, "at the immense good faith with which George Eliot carried out that elaborate misconception of hers." "Now Leo is going to begin," cried Rose. "He never has a good word to say for his people. He is always running them down." Now, Reuben Sachs is a really interesting novel. I do not think it's perfect. There are some Victorian stereotypes of Jewish people that Amy Levy plays with in a way that is a critique of Victorian society, but also reads slightly uncomfortably to a modern reader. However, unlike George Eliot, Amy Levy was Jewish herself, and one of the things I found so interesting in this book is that while Daniel Deronda is very much focused on the kind of ideological and spiritual aspects of Judaism, Reuben Sachs looks much more at kind of Jewish communities within London in the Victorian period and what it was like in kind of everyday life to be Jewish, and the kind of separate other side of London society that existed amongst Jewish families in the Victorian period who lived in some way apart from Christian families of a similar class. It's a really interesting book for looking at how religion affects kind of social groups and families and the way society structures itself. All in all, it's a very interesting read and very unusual for a Victorian novel. It's definitely one that I would recommend. So there we have it. Those are 5 Victorian novels that I think look really interestingly at religion. Do let me know down in the comments if you have any other Victorian books you'd like to recommend that look really interestingly at religion. There are so many. I could have easily talked today about Kim by Rudyard Kipling, as I said, or about North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, or about Villette by Charlotte Bronte, or about so many books by Anthony Trollope and a whole load of Dickens books as well. But 5 is all we have time for in this series, so hopefully you've got some good recommendations from here. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video. And the bishops, the bishop, and the bishops faction, and the bishops faction, and the bishops faction, and the bishops faction, and the bishop's faction, and the bishop's faction, and the bishop's faction. Oh my god.